My name is Courtney Krapser, and I will be presenting on ocean acidification versus the Great Barrier Reef. We are, of course, talking about the Great Barrier Reef just off the coast of Australia, or in the northeast region of the country. And as you can see, it starts over here by Lizard Island and snakes all the way down to Great Palm Island. And a big city over there is Cairns. It's right in the Coral Sea, and it's not very wide. I mean, it is, but it doesn't go very much into the ocean because, of course, it needs shallow water. There are many services provided by the reef, some of which include fishing, scuba diving, and food for animals such as birds or other marine animals such as bigger fish or whales or any other sea living creature that needs to eat. The reef receives runoff from 35 major catchments that drain 424,000 square kilometers off coastal Queensland. So that means that the reef receives any water that accesses storm drains from people washing their cars or watering their lawns or dumping water from something that they used earlier, or even from storms, from the rain that falls. And it is also home for ocean and bird life. A surprising amount of birds live at the Great Barrier Reef because some of it is above water and they can nest there, but it's also pretty close to the island of Australia so that they can have their home there and then travel out to the Great Barrier Reef. Actually, anywhere from several hundred species of birds live around the Great Barrier Reef. And ocean life include anything from clownfish to stingrays, to turtles, to eels, anything that wants to seek shelter from the temperature or other predators or fishermen. And then it's also a good place for fishermen because there are so many types of fish there that aren't seen anywhere else in the world. So it's a good place for competitions and just good old fishing. The reef has many impacts on the community. Examples of reef-dependent activities are traditional use of marine resources, so food and shelter for the marine life there, so the fish. Commercial marine tourism, bringing people out to the reef to view animals, or the reef itself, which is beautiful, or any other, just the ocean, or any other thing that's living out there. Fishing, as I said previously, there are many fish there, so fishermen like to go out, and they actually have several different methods to fish, and some of them just are using fishing poles, others are using spears. It all depends on the type of fisherman. Recreation and research and educational activities, because the reef is such an important part of our ecological system. There are many things to learn from it, so it's very good for education. And then reef-dependent activities are likely to be more sensitive to changes in the condition of the region's values, which is something we will talk about later. But anything that happens to the reef in these will affect these reef-dependent activities and can positively or negatively affect them. But normally when we're talking about changes in the reef, they're negative, because reefs are actually very fragile and they don't cope well in new abodes. Now let's talk about ocean acidification, which is the actual problem here that we will be discussing. Ocean acidification is when pollutions in the ocean from garbage we throw in there, or toxins that are collected in the rain, or anything else that is not natural to the ocean affects the wildlife there. So how it happens. Aside from temperature, other stressors such as tropical cyclones, freshwater inflows, and anthropogenic pollution can also induce bleaching, but to a far lesser extent, and generally not on large spatial scales. So this just explains how fragile the Great Barrier Reef actually is. Anything as little as temperature can make the Great Barrier Reef freak out and harm itself. But then more extreme is, of course, cyclones, even freshwater inflows, so from the runoff from the Queen's Island and other pollutions can hurt the reef. And how it affects the Great Barrier Reef? Well, as we said before, it hurts it. But how this happens is the zooxanthellae begins to produce toxic waste products which poison the coral until it rejects the zooxanthellae, expelling it into the open water. When this happens, the coral turns white, and this is known as coral bleaching. Zooxanthellae is what is found in the inside of the reef. It's kind of like their blood system. And so it keeps the reef healthy and alive, but when it's affected by these little changes in temperature or other stressors, it starts to freak out and it tries to protect itself. But when it tries to protect itself, it produces these toxic waste products which end up just harming itself and killing itself, which is one reason why it's very hard to protect the Great Barrier Reef, because not only is it fragile, but it actually is not very good at protecting itself. So this is known as coral bleaching, and it is a result of ocean acidification. Roots of the problem. There are many roots to this problem that we can discuss, but I would chose 3 of the major ones. The first one would be lack of education. There are just simply not enough people in the world who understand this problem or even know that this problem is as huge and important as it is. We don't directly have the effects of the Great Barrier Reef dying, therefore we think we don't have to worry about it, when in actuality the loss of the Great Barrier Reef would be horrible for our planet because it does so much for us, not only in providing marine life and food for our restaurants, but on a more practical scale, the Great Barrier Reef protects the coast of Australia from huge waves that would otherwise be devastating to the coast. So it breaks down these waves into smaller waves, which then the coast can handle. So we need to understand what we're losing if we don't change our ways and protect the reef instead of destroying it like we are now. There are also no policies. Well, there are, but the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act just came into play a couple of years ago. And before that, there were no policies that protected the reef at all, just because we didn't think it was as big as a deal as we know it is now. So the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act just covers so many topics on what to do and what not to do when interacting with the reef, and how it explains how fragile it is and how important it is to our ecosystem. Other policies include businesses are required to submit a regulatory plan each fiscal year. This means that they have to include any changes they make in their financials, so any activities that they do, whether that be their sewage system changed, or they're getting rid of their waste differently, whether that be doing it themselves, that would need to be checked up on and make sure that it is healthy for the environment, however they're intending to do it, or whether they're hiring a company to do it and whether that company is safe at disposing of these wastes and how they do it, and also any general changes that a business is making. Another huge problem is that we are excluding the economic costs of the problem. So what really should happen is that the fish should be more expensive that we get from the Great Barrier Reef, because then the extra money that we get from the fish will be able to go towards helping the Great Barrier Reef in saving it and in reducing the toxins that it is exposed to. So when we pay for the problem now, we aren't paying for the problem. We're paying the companies that get their riches from the Great Barrier Reef. We're not actually helping it in the economic costs, which is a big problem. Because if we were to include the economic costs, so many of our actions and habits that we do now would be cut off right away because it would just be too expensive for us to continue on the path that we are going. Solutions. What can we do to better protect our Great Barrier Reef? Well, Susan Tate, a noted environmentalist, has 8 steps to reducing ocean acidification. Now remember that most of these steps will mainly be directed towards Australians and other people who live closer to the reef, but we can all take these into consideration because we all live close to a watershed, or we're all in a watershed that feeds into a river or a lake that then feeds into the lakes of Michigan or the oceans, and we're all connected, and so we can all do our part in trying to keep it as clean as possible. So the first step we can do is wash our car on the lawn, not on the driveway, to minimize detergent runoff into drains. Because when we wash our car on the driveway or road, that water doesn't seep into the ground. It just runs off into the storm drains, and any pollutants that are in the water that goes into the storm drains will then be delivered directly to the rivers or lakes, which then can negatively affect any of the animals or plants that are living in that river or lake, and they could die. But when we wash our car on the lawn, then it's just seeped into the ground. Use environmentally friendly cleaners and fertilizers. This is the same reason as the first one, just so those don't get taken into any storm drain that then goes directly to a river or lake. This will keep it in the ground or in the yard and away from any important moving water. Keep gutters, sinks, and drains free of chemical and rubbish, as what washes down sinks and drains could end up on the reef. This is the same idea, just used as a sink, so you don't want to dump any toxic waste down in the sink, because even though they are normally connected to a sewage, they could have a sewage overflow, which would then have the possibility of contaminating the groundwater or the clean water pipes that are then delivered to a lake or ocean, and then they would be infected. And minimize water runoff by planting trees, garden beds, and ground cover around your home. One problem with having all of your water seep into the ground is that on rare occasions it could seep into the groundwater beneath the surface, which would then poison the entire groundwater and subsequently poisoning the rivers or whatever the groundwater feeds into. But by planting trees and garden beds, then that is absorbed into the plants and then expelled through the atmosphere, or the plants keep it in their system. Use reusable shopping bags rather than plastic bags, because plastic bags, as we all know, normally end up in the dump or in the cluster of trash in the ocean, and sometimes they will make their ways to the reefs or any other place, and turtles will come up and eat them thinking they're jellyfish, and then they'll die. So using reusable shopping bags, of course, is more expensive, but it's sustainable and healthier for our environment. Take your rubbish home with you. Don't leave it out in the open for other animals to eat. That's not cool. When enjoying any coral reef, don't touch it. It's very sensitive and is prone to self-harm when changes are in the air. And also advocate for the protection. We as a people, as a group, have the loudest voice than any other individual. So if we are all talking about this problem and acknowledge it as a huge problem, then we have the most influence than anyone else. In conclusion, mass coral bleaching events due to rising ocean temperatures occurred in the summer of 1998, 02, and 06. And it is expected that coral bleaching will become an annual occurrence. And this is linked to world water temperature increase due to a particularly warm El Niño, which is probably a result of global warming, which will then affect negatively the coral reefs. And this will then, in consequence, continue to have mass bleachings. So roots of the problem are lack of education, no policies, and excluding economic costs out of the problem.